A chance encounter and an unexpected offer. Jason never expected his Friday night to be anything special. It was supposed to be the usual, hanging out with his best friend, Tom, playing games, and unwinding from the stress of college life. That was their routine, and Jason welcomed the predictability. But as soon as he stepped inside Tom's house, something felt different. The familiar scent of home-cooked food filled the air, a warm and inviting aroma that had become synonymous with Tom's house over the years. Jason had spent countless nights here, practically a second home to him. But tonight, there was an undeniable shift in the air. "Hey, man," Tom called from the couch, barely looking up from his controller. "You're late. I already started without you." Jason smirked, dropping his bag by the door. "Wow, thanks for waiting. Such a great friend." Tom only shrugged, too absorbed in his game to care. But Jason's attention had already drifted to the kitchen, where he spotted Tom's mom, Laura, standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot. He hadn't seen her in a while, maybe a few weeks, but she looked different. There was a softness about her that caught him off guard. Her usual rushed, get-everything-done energy was missing, replaced by something quieter, more subdued. "Hey, Jason," she greeted with a tired but warm smile. "How's it going?" "Hey, Mrs. Carter," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "I'm good, just the usual grind." She nodded knowingly, setting the spoon down and rubbing the back of her neck absently. "Tell me about it. Work's been crazy, and I've barely had a minute to breathe." Jason hesitated, watching her movements. There was tension in the way she held herself, the stiffness in her shoulders. He wasn't sure why, but he noticed it more than usual. "You okay?" he asked before he could stop himself. Laura let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "I'm fine. Just exhausted. My back's been killing me lately. I think I've been sitting at my desk too much." That caught his attention. He had never heard her complain about anything like that before. Laura was the kind of woman who powered through things without stopping to acknowledge her own discomfort. "Have you tried a heating pad or something?" he suggested, leaning against the counter. "I have," she sighed. "It helps a little, but not enough. I guess it just comes with the territory of getting older." Jason frowned at that. It wasn't like Laura to sound so resigned. He wasn't a professional, but he knew a thing or two about sore muscles. Back when he worked part-time at a gym, he had learned the basics of massage therapy. Enough to help friends and family when they were sore. Without really thinking, he found himself saying, "I could give you a quick massage if you want. Might help with the tension." Laura turned to look at him, a little surprised. "Wait, what?" Jason immediately felt a rush of embarrassment. Maybe that was weird to offer. He wasn't exactly a licensed therapist. "I mean only if you're comfortable with it," he added quickly, scratching the back of his neck. "I've given a few before, nothing professional. Just helping people out when they've been sore. It might help." Laura seemed to consider it, chewing on her lip. Jason wasn't sure what she was thinking, but after a moment, she gave a small shrug. "You know what? Why not? At this point, I'll try anything." Jason wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or more nervous. He wasn't trying to make anything weird. He genuinely just wanted to help. "All right," he said, clearing his throat. "Let's do it in the living room. The couch will be more comfortable." She nodded, wiping her hands on a towel before following him out. Tom was still glued to his game, oblivious to the conversation, which somehow made Jason feel a little better. Laura sat down on the couch, pulling her hair to one side to give him access to her back. Jason positioned himself behind her, hovering awkwardly for a second before finally resting his hands on her shoulders. As soon as he touched her, he could feel how tense she was. Her muscles were tight, knotted with stress. "Wow," he muttered without thinking. "You weren't kidding." Laura chuckled softly. "Yeah, it's pretty bad, huh?" He pressed his fingers into her shoulders, applying just enough pressure to start working out the knots. Laura let out a small sigh, her body shifting slightly as she relaxed into his touch. That actually feels really good, she admitted, her voice softer than usual. Jason focused on his movements, careful and deliberate. He could feel the tension melting away bit by bit, her body slowly relaxing. The atmosphere in the room shifted, not awkward, not uncomfortable, but something else. Something Jason couldn't quite put into words. For the next several minutes, they sat in near silence, the only sounds being the occasional clicks of Tom's controller and Laura's slow, relaxed breathing. Jason had never really thought much about Laura beyond the fact that she was Tom's mom. A great one, at that. But sitting here, feeling the warmth of her skin under his hands, hearing the way her breath hitched every time he worked out a particularly tight spot, it felt different, more personal. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. When he finally pulled back, Laura turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Wow," she said after a moment. "I didn't think that would actually help, but it did. I feel so much better." Jason smiled, trying to ignore the strange flutter in his chest. "Glad I could help." The silence that followed was different from before. He wasn't sure why, but there was something lingering in the air between them. Something unspoken. Jason tried to shake it off, turning his attention back to the game Tom was playing. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop his mind from drifting back to the warmth of Laura's skin, the way she had sighed under his touch. Things felt different now, and he had a feeling this wasn't something he could just forget. An unspoken connection. The night passed in a strange blur. Jason had tried to focus on playing games with Tom, but his mind kept drifting. Every now and then, he would steal a glance toward the kitchen, where Laura sat at the counter, absent-mindedly sipping from a glass of wine. She looked more relaxed now, almost peaceful, but there was something else in the way she held herself. It wasn't the same hurried, always on-the-go energy she usually carried. She seemed different. Jason didn't know why he kept noticing these things. Maybe it was because, for the first time, he had actually stopped to pay attention. Maybe it was because something between them had shifted in a way he didn't fully understand. "Dude, focus," Tom groaned, nudging him with an elbow. "You're getting destroyed." Jason blinked, snapping back to the game. "Right. Sorry." Tom gave him a weird look but didn't push it, going back to button-mashing his way to victory. But even as Jason tried to concentrate, the weight of the night lingered in the back of his mind. Eventually, Tom stretched and let out a loud yawn. "All right, man. I'm calling it. I'm beat." Jason checked his phone, realizing how late it had gotten. "Yeah, I should probably head out soon." Tom waved him off. "Nah, just crash here. You know my mom won't mind. Besides, I think she likes having you around." Something about the way Tom said it made Jason's stomach do an uncomfortable flip. He forced a casual nod. "Yeah, all right. Thanks." Tom didn't think anything of it, already halfway to his room before Jason had even stood up. Now, it was just him and Laura. Jason hesitated for a second before making his way to the kitchen. Laura was still sitting at the counter, twirling the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. She looked up as he approached, giving him a small, tired smile. "You're staying over?" she asked. "Yeah." Tom insisted, Jason said, rubbing the back of his neck. Laura nodded, setting her glass down. "Good. It's late." Jason leaned against the counter, unsure of why he hadn't just gone to bed yet. But there was something in the air between them, something unspoken. He wasn't sure if he should say something, acknowledge the shift. But before he could, Laura spoke first. "You know, I haven't felt this relaxed in a long time." Jason looked at her, noticing the way she seemed almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she should be admitting this. "I'm glad," he said honestly. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this. I guess I just..." She paused, running a hand through her hair. "I don't really talk to anyone about this kind of stuff." Jason frowned. "You don't talk to Tom?" She shook her head. "No, I mean..." He's my son. I don't want to put that weight on him. He doesn't need to worry about me." Jason didn't like the way that sounded. He knew Laura was strong. She always had been. But hearing her say it like that, like she was used to carrying everything alone, made his chest feel strangely tight. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know," he said softly. Laura looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment, Jason felt like he had said something she had been waiting to hear for a long time. A silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Jason's pulse quickened, though he wasn't entirely sure why. It wasn't like this was some big, defining moment, but it felt important. It felt real. Laura exhaled, breaking the tension. "You should get some rest," she said, her voice gentler now. Jason nodded, knowing she was right. But as he turned to leave, he hesitated at the doorway. "I meant what I said," he murmured. Laura tilted her head slightly. "What?" Jason turned back to face her. "You don't have to do it alone." Laura held his gaze for a second, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Then slowly she smiled. "Good night, Jason." He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Good night, Laura." As Jason made his way to the guest room, his thoughts were tangled in a way they hadn't been before. Something had shifted between them tonight. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he was pretty sure it wasn't something he could just ignore. The next morning, Jason woke up earlier than expected. He stretched, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, before making his way downstairs. Laura was already in the kitchen, dressed casually in a hoodie and leggings, making coffee. The warm aroma filled the space, mixing with the scent of toast and eggs. She turned when she heard him. "Morning," she said with a smile. "Morning," Jason replied, feeling strangely self-conscious. Tom was nowhere to be seen, which meant it was just the two of them again. Jason didn't know why that suddenly felt like such a big deal. "Sleep okay?" Laura asked, handing him a mug of coffee. "Yeah, thanks," he said, taking the sip. There was a comfortable silence between them as they ate breakfast. Laura seemed more at ease today, though Jason noticed the occasional glance she stole in his direction. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but something felt different. "I was thinking of going for a walk later," Laura said suddenly. "I haven't had a chance to just get out and clear my head in a while." Jason hesitated, then found himself saying, "I'll come with you, if you want." Laura raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Jason said, "but I want to." Something in her expression softened. She looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, that sounds nice." The walk was quiet, peaceful. The air was crisp, and the trees lining the park were beginning to shed their autumn leaves. Jason walked beside Laura, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Laura sighed. "I feel like I'm figuring things out all over again," she admitted. Jason glanced at her. "How do you mean?" She looked down at the path ahead of them. "I've spent so much of my life taking care of other people. Tom, work, the house. I don't think I ever really stopped to think about myself." Jason frowned. "That's not fair to you." Laura let out a small chuckle. "Maybe not, but it's just how things have been." Jason was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "You deserve to be taken care of too." Laura glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Jason didn't know where the words had come from, but he meant them. The conversation shifted after that, but something about the moment lingered. As they walked back to the house, Jason found himself glancing at Laura again, noticing the small, thoughtful smile on her lips. Something had changed between them. And this time, Jason wasn't so sure he wanted to ignore it. A shift in the air. Jason had always thought of Tom's house as a second home, a place where he could unwind and forget about the stress of college and work. But now, it felt different. It wasn't anything obvious. No dramatic changes in routine, no major confessions, but something had shifted. He could feel it in the way Laura looked at him, in the way their conversations lingered just a little longer, in the way silence between them was no longer empty, but full of something unspoken. He wasn't sure what that something was. And honestly, he wasn't sure if he was ready to find out. The days passed, each one blending into the next. Jason found himself spending more and more time at Tom's house, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Laura had started going on morning walks again, something she had mentioned she used to love, but had stopped making time for. It had become their quiet ritual. Jason would show up early, and they would walk through the park together before Tom even woke up. At first, they talked about small things: work, school, the weather. But slowly, the conversations grew deeper. One morning, as they strolled down a quiet path lined with golden leaves, Laura sighed. "You ever feel like you're just stuck?" she asked. Jason glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, kicking at a fallen leaf. "Like you've been living your life on autopilot for so long that you don't even know who you are anymore." Jason thought about it for a moment. "Yeah," he admitted. "I think everyone feels that way at some point, but I think the real question is, what do you want?" Laura smiled faintly. "That's the thing. I don't know. I've spent so much time taking care of everything else, Tom, work, the house, that I've never really asked myself that." Jason didn't know why, but hearing her say that made his chest feel tight. "You should," he said softly. "You should ask yourself that." She nodded, but he could tell she wasn't sure how to answer. And that realization made Jason wonder just how much of herself Laura had given away over the years. How much she had sacrificed. How much she had ignored her own needs in favor of making sure everyone else was okay. For the first time, he saw her not just as Tom's mom, but as Laura, a woman who had spent so long being strong for others that she had forgotten how to be soft for herself. Later that afternoon, Tom had plans to go out with some friends, leaving Jason and Laura alone in the house again. It wasn't unusual. Jason had been over 1,000,000 times before, but this time, it felt different. "I was going to make some tea," Laura said as she walked into the living room. "Want some?" Jason looked up from his phone. "Yeah, that sounds good." A few minutes later, she returned with 2 cups, handing one to him before sitting on the other side of the couch. For a while, they just sat there, sipping their tea in comfortable silence. Then, out of nowhere, Laura chuckled. Jason raised an eyebrow. "What?" She shook her head, smiling into her cup. "I don't know. I guess I didn't expect you to be here so much." Jason frowned slightly. "Do you want me to leave?" Laura's smile faded, and she looked at him, serious now. "No, that's not what I meant." Jason held her gaze, something in his stomach twisting. "Then what did you mean?" She hesitated, setting her cup down on the coffee table. "I just meant, it's nice." "What is?" She exhaled slowly, looking down at her hands. "Having someone around who actually listens, who doesn't just see me as Tom's mom." Jason's grip tightened around his cup. Because that was exactly what had been gnawing at him too. He didn't just see her as Tom's mom anymore, and he wasn't sure when that changed, or if it was supposed to change at all. That night, after Tom came home and went straight to bed, Jason found himself standing in the kitchen with Laura again. She was washing dishes, humming softly to herself. The warm glow of the overhead light cast a golden hue over her, making her seem softer somehow. "Want some help?" Jason asked. Laura glanced at him over her shoulder. "You don't have to." "I know," he said, stepping forward anyway. "But I want to." She smiled, handing him a towel to dry the dishes. "Well, I won't say no to that." For the next few minutes, they worked in quiet rhythm, Laura washing, Jason drying. It was such a simple thing, but there was something intimate about it. Like they weren't just existing in the same space, but sharing it. Halfway through, Laura let out a soft sigh, rolling her shoulders. "Back still hurting?" Jason asked. She gave him a sheepish smile. "A little." Jason hesitated before speaking. "I could help again, if you want." Laura turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. A part of Jason expected her to say no, to brush it off, to pretend like last time hadn't happened. But she didn't. Instead, she gave a small nod. "Okay." Jason swallowed, his heart picking up speed. He wasn't sure why he felt nervous. It was just a massage. Except, it wasn't. A few minutes later, they were in the living room again. Laura sat on the couch, pulling her hair to one side, exposing the smooth curve of her neck. Jason sat behind her, taking a deep breath before resting his hands on her shoulders. She was warm beneath his touch. Slowly, he began working out the tension, his fingers pressing into the knots of her muscles. Laura sighed, her body relaxing almost instantly. "Oh, that's nice." Jason swallowed hard. "Yeah." She nodded. "You have good hands." Jason let out a quiet chuckle, trying to ignore the way his stomach flipped at her words. "I'll take that as a compliment." The minutes stretched on, slow and unhurried. Jason was hyper-aware of everything: the warmth of her skin, the softness of her sighs, the way she leaned into his touch without hesitation. He told himself this was normal. But deep down, he knew better. Eventually, Jason pulled his hands away, suddenly needing space. Laura turned slightly, looking at him with something unreadable in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Jason nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Anytime." The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something neither of them were willing to name just yet. But as Jason sat there, watching the way Laura's lips parted slightly, her eyes searching his, he realized that things had already changed, and there was no going back now. The line between us. Jason wasn't sure when everything started to feel different, but there was no denying it anymore. For the past few weeks, he had been spending more time at Tom's house than ever before, but it wasn't just because of Tom. It was Laura. The way she moved through the house with quiet grace, the way she sipped her tea in the mornings, the way she looked at him sometimes, like she was seeing him, really seeing him. And the problem was, he saw her too. Not just as Tom's mom, but as Laura. As a woman who had spent so much time putting others first that she had forgotten what it was like to be cared for. And Jason wanted to care, even if he wasn't sure what that meant. It started small. Little moments that felt bigger than they should have. Like the way their morning walks had become a quiet ritual, where she opened up to him in ways she didn't with anyone else. Or the way she had started leaning into him, figuratively and sometimes literally, when the weight of the day became too much. Jason knew he should be careful, but it was hard to stop himself from getting pulled in. One evening, Tom had plans with his friends again, leaving Jason and Laura alone in the house. It was starting to happen more often. Not intentionally, of course. But Jason wasn't stupid. He knew that something was happening. He just wasn't sure what. "Want to watch a movie?" Laura asked, stretching as she walked into the living room. Jason was already on the couch, his legs stretched out lazily. "Depends. Are you going to pick something depressing?" Laura smirked. "No promises." Jason chuckled, shaking his head as she grabbed the remote. They settled in, the lights dimmed, the only sound being the soft hum of the TV as the opening credits rolled. At first, it was normal. They sat with space between them, watching in comfortable silence. But at some point, Jason noticed Laura shifting slightly, her arm resting against the back of the couch. And then, without even thinking, she leaned into him. Not completely. Not enough to cross any lines. But enough that Jason could feel the warmth of her against his side. His heart stuttered. It was subtle, probably innocent, but Jason felt it. And once he felt it, he couldn't ignore it. They stayed like that for a while, neither of them acknowledging it. The movie played on, but Jason wasn't really paying attention anymore. His focus was on the way Laura's breathing had slowed, the way her body had naturally relaxed against his. It wasn't intimate. Not really. but it wasn't not intimate either. And that was what scared him. When the movie ended, Laura sat up, stretching again. "That was better than I expected," she admitted. Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah, not bad." She turned to look at him then, her expression softer than usual. "I like this," she said quietly. Jason frowned slightly. "What?" She hesitated, as if debating whether or not to say it. Then finally, "Just having someone here." Jason swallowed. "I like it too." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and as soon as he said them, he knew they meant more than they should have. Laura seemed to hear it too. Her lips parted slightly, her gaze lingering on him just a moment too long. Jason knew he should get up, say goodnight, break whatever spell had settled between them. But he didn't. Instead, he just sat there, his chest tight, his mind racing. And for the first time, he wondered if they were both pretending not to see what was happening between them. Because at this point, it was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Jason woke up earlier than usual. He had barely slept, his mind too tangled in thoughts of last night. As he made his way downstairs, he found Laura in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She looked up when she saw him, offering a small smile. "Morning." "Morning," Jason murmured, rubbing the back of his neck. For a second, there was silence. Then Laura sighed. "Jason, we should probably talk." Jason's stomach twisted. That was never a good sentence. "Yeah," he said, leaning against the counter. "We probably should." Laura exhaled, setting her cup down. "I don't know what's happening here," she admitted, "but I know that I don't want to make things weird." Jason nodded slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Neither do I." Laura hesitated. "But something has changed, right?" Jason looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment, he knew there was no point in lying. "Yeah," he admitted, "something's changed." Laura pressed her lips together, as if she wasn't sure what to do with that answer. I don't want to overthink this. I don't want to ruin whatever this is." Jason nodded, even though he wasn't sure what this even was. But he understood what she was saying. They were standing at the edge of something, and if they weren't careful, they were going to fall. And Jason wasn't sure if either of them were ready for that. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. They still talked. They still laughed. But there was an awareness between them now, a new kind of tension that hadn't been there before. At one point, Laura caught his eye from across the room, and Jason swore he saw something flicker in her expression. Something that made his chest feel too tight. He needed space. He needed to breathe. But every time he thought about stepping away, something pulled him back. And Jason wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend that wasn't happening. Later that night, after Tom had gone to bed, Jason found himself in the kitchen again. Laura was there too, leaning against the counter with a glass of wine in her hand. Jason hesitated before stepping inside. "You okay?" he asked. Laura let out a quiet laugh. "That's my line." Jason smirked, but there was no real humor behind it. They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Then Laura exhaled. "Jason, I don't want to make things complicated." Jason swallowed. "Neither do I." Laura looked at him then, her gaze searching. "But it already is, isn't it?" Jason didn't answer right away. Because he already knew the truth. Yeah, it was complicated. And the problem was, neither of them wanted to stop. A line between us. Jason could feel the tension between them thickening, like an invisible force neither of them could fully name, yet both were acutely aware of. Laura stood a few feet away from him, her fingers loosely gripping the stem of her wine glass, her gaze flickering between Jason and the countertop, like she was trying to convince herself this wasn't happening. But it was. Jason swallowed hard, bracing his hands against the counter behind him. "Yeah," he finally admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "It's already complicated." Laura let out a breath she seemed to have been holding. Her shoulders dropped slightly, but not in relief. More like acceptance. They weren't stupid. They weren't naive. They knew the moment they acknowledged this, whatever this was, they couldn't go back to pretending. Laura took another slow sip of wine, then set her glass down with a quiet clink. "I don't know what to do about that," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Jason's jaw tensed. "Do we have to do anything?" he asked cautiously. She looked up at him then, her expression unreadable. There was something searching in her gaze, like she was trying to find an answer inside of him, but Jason wasn't sure he had one to give. After a long pause, she sighed, rubbing a hand over her forehead. "This isn't fair to you," she said. "I don't want you caught up in my mess." Jason frowned. "You're not a mess, Laura." She let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Maybe not on the outside." Jason stared at her, trying to piece together what she was feeling, what she wasn't saying. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that he could see the way her breath hitched slightly. Close enough that the space between them wasn't just physical, it was charged. "Listen," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know what this is, okay? But I know I don't want to pretend it's not happening." Laura's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, but no words came out. Jason continued, "I don't expect anything from you. I don't need some grand explanation. But if you're telling me you don't feel anything..." He swallowed. "Then I'll back off. Just say the word." Laura inhaled sharply, her hands gripping the counter behind her like she needed something solid to hold on to. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Then, finally, she exhaled. "I do feel something," she whispered, barely audible. Jason's chest tightened. He had known it. He had felt it. But hearing her say it made it real. For the first time, there was no pretending. Laura shook her head, almost like she was frustrated with herself. "I just don't know what to do with that." Jason didn't either. But he knew one thing. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. She looked up at him, and for a moment, something in her eyes softened, just a little. The weight of the conversation lingered in the air, but neither of them made a move to change it. Because they both knew that nothing was going to be the same after tonight. Later that night, Jason couldn't sleep. After their conversation in the kitchen, Laura had retreated to her bedroom, and Jason had gone to the guest room, but his mind wouldn't shut off. He stared at the ceiling, his heartbeat still unsteady. Had that really happened? Had they really said those things out loud? It had been unspoken for so long that actually acknowledging it made it feel even more real. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. This was dangerous. Whatever this was, it was teetering on the edge of something they couldn't take back. But Jason didn't want to take it back. And that was the scariest part. At some point, exhaustion started to weigh on him, and his eyes drifted shut. But sometime in the middle of the night, a quiet sound pulled him from the haze of sleep. A soft knock. Jason blinked, trying to orient himself. Then he heard it again. Knock. Knock. His pulse spiked. Sitting up, he hesitated before pulling the blanket off and moving toward the door. When he opened it, Laura stood there, her expression unreadable, her hair slightly messy from sleep. She wasn't wearing her usual guarded expression. She wasn't putting up walls. She looked raw. Jason's throat went dry. "Laura?" She hesitated. She shook her head slightly, letting out a slow breath. "I don't know why I'm here." Jason stared at her for a moment before stepping back. "You want to come in?" She hesitated again. Then, slowly, she nodded. Jason stepped aside as she entered the room. The door closed softly behind her, and just like that, the line between them blurred even more. A step too close. Jason's heart pounded as he stood in the dim glow of the guest room, the air between him and Laura thick with unspoken words. She was standing just inside the door, her arms crossed over her chest, like she was trying to shield herself from something. Maybe from him, maybe from herself. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. Jason swallowed hard. "Then why are you?" Laura didn't answer right away. She took a shaky breath, staring at the floor as if she was searching for an explanation. But the truth was, there wasn't one. Not one that made sense. And yet, here she was. Jason knew he should step back, create space between them, make it easier for her to leave. But he didn't move. Because a part of him, a dangerous, selfish part, didn't want her to go. Finally, she looked up, meeting his gaze with a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "I don't know." Jason's jaw tightened. Because that was the most honest thing either of them had said all night. A tension neither could name. The room felt smaller with Laura standing there, her presence filling every inch of space between them. Jason exhaled slowly, trying to steady his thoughts. "Laura." She shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have knocked. She let out a soft, almost frustrated sigh. "I couldn't sleep." Jason ran a hand over his face. He knew what she meant. Because neither could he. Something between them had shifted so abruptly, so completely, that there was no way to pretend it hadn't happened. "We should talk," Laura said finally. Jason hesitated. Because talking meant saying things out loud. Talking meant admitting that this thing between them wasn't just in his head. Talking meant facing the truth, and he wasn't sure either of them were ready for that. But still, he nodded. "Yeah, we should." The truth between them. Laura moved to sit on the edge of the bed, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Jason sat beside her, keeping just enough distance to be respectful, but not so much that it felt like he was pushing her away. She let out a quiet breath. "Jason, this is wrong, isn't it?" Jason felt something sharp lodge itself in his chest. He didn't answer right away, because he wasn't sure what she wanted him to say. Was it wrong? Maybe. But did it feel wrong? No. And that was the problem. Laura looked up at him, searching his face. "Say something." Jason exhaled, his voice quieter than he intended. "I don't know what you want me to say." "Tell me I'm crazy," she murmured. "Tell me I'm imagining all of this." Jason clenched his fists. Because he could say that. He could laugh it off, make it easy for her, pretend like this was all in her head. But it wasn't. And she knew it. So instead he said, "You're not crazy." Laura inhaled sharply. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she whispered, "I don't know what to do." Jason turned to face her fully. She looked lost. And Jason hated that. Because Laura wasn't the kind of woman who ever looked lost. "You don't have to do anything," Jason said softly. Her lips parted slightly. "What if I want to?" Jason's breath caught. And for the first time, he realized just how dangerous this was. A moment too close. Laura looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. Jason knew that if he reached for her right now, she wouldn't pull away. And that terrified him. Because if they crossed that line, there would be no going back. So he did the only thing he could do. He forced himself to stand. Laura looked up at him, startled by the sudden movement. "Jason." Jason ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the tightness in his chest. "I think you should go back to bed." Laura blinked, clearly not expecting that. He saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Hurt? Relief? He couldn't tell. But she nodded slowly, standing up too. "Yeah," she whispered. "You're probably right." Jason exhaled, relieved, but also disappointed. No, not disappointed. Just lost. Laura took a step toward the door, then hesitated. She turned back to face him, her eyes searching his. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Jason felt his throat tighten. "Don't be." Because this wasn't her fault. It wasn't his either. It was just complicated. She nodded once, then slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And for the first time, he let himself admit it. He wanted her, not just in the way a man wants a woman, but in a way that was deeper than that. In a way that terrified him. But no matter how much he tried to fight it, he knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A door left open. Jason barely slept that night. After Laura left his room, he had lain awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts he knew he shouldn't be having. Thoughts about her. About the way she looked at him when she said, "What if I want to?" About the hesitation in her voice. About the way she had stood in the doorway, as if waiting for him to stop her. And the worst part, a part of him had wanted to stop her, not to push her away, but to pull her closer, to erase the doubt in her eyes, to tell her that whatever this was, whatever they had been circling around for weeks, it wasn't wrong. It was real. And Jason had never been more sure of anything in his life. The morning after, when he finally dragged himself out of bed, it was later than usual. The house was quiet, too quiet, and he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. He found Laura in the kitchen, standing by the stove, staring at her coffee like it held all the answers to the universe. She looked exhausted, like she had barely slept either. Jason hesitated before stepping inside. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Laura stiffened slightly but didn't look up. "Morning." Jason waited, half expecting her to say more, to acknowledge what had happened last night. But she didn't. She just took a slow sip of her coffee, as if it was any other day, as if she hadn't stood in his doorway at 2 a.m, her eyes filled with something neither of them had been ready to name. Jason exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Maybe this was how it had to be. Maybe it was better if they didn't talk about it. Maybe. "I need to say something," Laura said suddenly, setting her mug down. Jason's stomach twisted. Here it was. He braced himself. "Okay." Laura turned to face him, crossing her arms over her chest. "Last night," she let out a slow breath. "That can't happen again." Jason felt something tighten in his chest. He nodded slowly, even though every part of him wanted to disagree. "Okay." Laura searched his face, as if expecting him to argue. When he didn't, she exhaled. "Good." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Jason clenched his jaw. "So we're just gonna pretend it didn't happen." Laura looked away. "I think it's for the best." Jason let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Right. Of course." Laura flinched slightly at his tone. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something else. But then, she just grabbed her coffee and turned back to the stove. And Jason knew the conversation was over. For now. A forced distance. Jason tried to pull away after that. He didn't stop coming over. He and Tom were still close. But he made an effort to keep his distance from Laura. No more long conversations in the kitchen. No more morning walks. No more moments that felt too much like something else. And Laura, she let him. She didn't reach out. She didn't try to close the space between them. It was like an unspoken agreement. If they ignored it long enough, maybe it would go away. But the problem was, it didn't. It only got worse. Because no matter how much Jason tried to pretend that night never happened, it was always there, lingering in the background, waiting. And some nights, when he closed his eyes, he could still see her standing in that doorway. Could still hear her whisper, "What if I want to?" And that was the thing about words. Once you said them, you couldn't take them back. Breaking point. It was a Friday night when everything unraveled. Jason had come over to hang out with Tom, same as always. They played games, talked about school, made plans for the weekend. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. Because every time Jason glanced toward the kitchen, he could feel Laura watching him. It wasn't obvious. She wasn't staring, but he could feel it. Like she was waiting for something. Like she was waiting for him. And Jason, he was so damn tired of pretending. It was late when Tom finally went to bed, leaving Jason alone in the living room. He was about to leave too, but then, Jason. His breath caught. Slowly, he turned. Laura was standing at the bottom of the stairs, her expression unreadable. Jason swallowed hard. Yeah? She hesitated, gripping the railing like she needed something solid to hold on to. I don't want things to be weird between us, she said finally. Jason let out a sharp breath. I don't either. Silence. Laura's fingers tightened on the railing. Then, before he could stop himself, Jason said, But they are. Laura's eyes flickered. I know. Jason clenched his jaw. Then what do we do about it? Laura exhaled, shaking her head. I don't know. Jason took a step closer. We can't just ignore it. Laura met his gaze, something conflicted in her expression. I thought that's what you wanted. Jason let out a frustrated laugh. No, that's what you wanted. Laura flinched. Jason ran a hand through his hair. Look, I get it. I do. You're scared. And maybe you should be, but stop pretending like I'm the only one feeling this. Laura didn't respond. Because she couldn't. Because she knew he was right. And Jason, he was done waiting for her to admit it. So he did the one thing he shouldn't do. He took another step forward, and then another, until he was standing right in front of her, until she was forced to look at him, until she had nowhere left to run. Laura inhaled sharply. Jason. He didn't touch her, didn't move, didn't do anything except wait. Because this time, she had to be the one to close the distance. And for a long, agonizing moment, she didn't. Then, Laura's breath hitched. Her fingers trembled. And slowly, almost hesitantly, she reached for him. A line crossed. Laura's hand hovered just inches from Jason's arm, hesitation flickering across her face, like a battle she was fighting within herself. Jason didn't move, didn't breathe. Because he knew that if he reached for her first, it would be crossing a line neither of them could pretend didn't exist. But then, in the space between heartbeats, Laura made her choice. She closed the distance. Her fingers brushed against his forearm, tentative, like she was testing the weight of her own decision. And just like that, it happened. Something unspoken snapped between them, unraveling everything they had tried so hard to keep in place. Jason exhaled sharply. Laura. Her name came out as a whisper, rough and uncertain, but she didn't pull away, didn't stop, didn't let go. Instead, she looked up at him, her expression raw and unguarded, her lips parted slightly like she wanted to say something, but no words came, because there was nothing left to say. Jason felt his restraint cracking, his pulse hammering in his ears as he forced himself to stay still, to let her decide, to let her lead this. And for a moment, he thought she was going to step back, that she was going to let go, shake her head, and pretend none of this ever happened. But she didn't. Instead, she exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around his wrist. And then, before either of them could think, she leaned in, slow, deliberate, inevitable. And Jason felt his heart stop. Her forehead barely brushed against his before she hesitated, hovering in that dangerous space where it would take only a fraction of movement to turn this into something they couldn't undo. But she didn't pull away, and neither did he. The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric, like the entire world had narrowed down to this single point in time. Then, finally, Laura pulled back. Not far. Just enough to look him in the eyes, her breath warm against his skin, her lips still parted like she was waiting for him to do something, to say something, to fix this before it became too much. Jason clenched his jaw. This is dangerous, he murmured. Laura swallowed. I know. Jason searched her face, his chest rising and falling with a weight he didn't know how to carry. If we do this, he trailed off, not even sure how to finish that sentence. Because if they did this, if they crossed that line, There was no telling where it would lead. But Laura already knew that. She didn't need him to say it. "I don't want to make a mistake," she whispered. Jason let out a quiet, shaky breath. Then we stop. A pause. A beat. And then Laura shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I don't want to stop." Jason's resolve shattered. And just like that, he was gone. A door left open. They didn't kiss that night. Didn't fall into each other the way stories often said people did. But something shifted. Something they couldn't take back. When Laura finally stepped away, she didn't look at him right away. She just stood there for a moment, her fingers still warm where they had been wrapped around his wrist, as if she was trying to convince herself that this was real. Then she exhaled. "I should go," she murmured. Jason nodded, though every part of him wanted to stop her. Laura hesitated again, like she was about to say something else. But she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked away, her steps slow, deliberate, like she wasn't quite sure she was making the right choice. And Jason, stood there in the dim glow of the hallway, his pulse still thrumming beneath his skin, watching her go. The days that followed, things didn't go back to normal. They couldn't. Because now, there was something between them. Something fragile and unspoken, something neither of them were ready to name but both knew was there. And no matter how much they tried to keep their distance, they couldn't seem to stay away. Little moments kept happening. A lingering glance, a brush of fingertips when they passed a coffee cup between them, a silence that stretched just a little too long. And every time Jason thought maybe he could pretend that nothing had changed, he would catch Laura looking at him when she thought he wasn't watching. Like she was remembering that night. Like she was wondering what would have happened if she hadn't walked away. A choice. It happened on a quiet afternoon. Tom was out again. Another weekend spent with his friends. And Jason had come by under the excuse of picking up something he had left behind. Laura was in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch, her hair pulled into a loose bun, the faintest hint of music playing from her phone. It was so normal, so ordinary. And yet, when she turned and met his gaze, Jason knew that they were about to make a choice that would define everything. Laura set down the dish she was holding, drying her hands on a towel. She didn't speak, didn't ask why he was still standing there, watching her. She just waited. And Jason knew he couldn't keep running from this. So he didn't. Instead, he took a step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of her, his hands gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Tell me to go," he said quietly. Laura stared at him, her breath catching slightly. Jason swallowed. "If you don't want this, if you don't want me, tell me to go." A pause. A moment. A choice. And then Laura reached up, slowly, hesitantly, and pressed her palm against his chest. Not pushing him away. Not pulling him closer. Just feeling. Jason let out a shaky breath. Then, softly, carefully, deliberately, Laura whispered, "I don't want you to go." Jason's heart slammed against his ribs. He covered her hand with his own, his fingers curling around hers. And just like that, the door between them wasn't just left open. It was gone. Epilogue. No going back. They didn't rush. Didn't dive headfirst into something reckless. Instead, they chose. Each and every day. They made the choice to figure this out. Some days were easy, filled with laughter and long conversations that felt like home. Other days were hard, filled with doubt, hesitation, the weight of a reality they couldn't ignore. But through it all, Jason never regretted choosing her. And Laura never regretted letting herself be chosen. Because in the end, some connections weren't meant to be ignored. Some moments weren't meant to be walked away from. And some doors were never meant to be closed.